All right, chapter 3 is one of the longest, but also one of the most important chapters in our textbook. And it's lots of stuff, lots of new things. So we're going to cover it a bit at a time, and I'll try and be as clear as I can as what's important. So this is our introduction to cells. And really, what we want to be able to do is define and describe cells and the parts of cells. And the major parts of cells are referred to as their organelles. And each of these is a little chemical composition that functions to do a specific job. Cells are important because all living parts of the body, all organisms, all life itself is made of one or more cells. And everything that that we think of as a life process occurs within a cell. Cells are the smallest part of our body that are truly alive, and they come from pre-existing cells. And so these are tiny, tiny, much less than a millimeter in length. Most of them are in the neighborhood of 1/100th of a millimeter in length. So they're quite small. You can only see them with a microscope, but they're everywhere. Our body is made up of literally trillions of cells. And so this picture that you see here under cell theory, that's a mucous membrane. And there's a line of cells at the top of this, and each one has a nucleus, a big dark staining round or oval dot. And then below them is a disorganized, less organized mass of cells called connective tissue. And so you are made of cells. Your skin is cells. Your hair is cells that are glued together. Your muscles are cells that are able to change shape. Your bones are secreted by the cells that live within them. Everything we do is cells, and understanding our body is really about understanding cells. And so this is another picture of a cell. This is one cell looked at with an electron microscope. And here you can see the nucleus is that big round thing in the center with dark and light areas. And there are these organelles that we talk about are chemical structures within cells where specific jobs happen. There's two types of organelles. There are organelles that are referred to as non-membranous, and most of these are made of protein or some sort of protein component. And lots of the movements of our cells are due to these non-membranous organelles. And so we'll talk about the cytoskeleton parts of that, and centrioles and cilia, and these are non-membranous structures. And the other non-membranous organelles act as enzymes. They control chemical reactions. And then in our cells, we also have little lipid bubbles. These are called membranous organelles, and they're compartments with an outer lipid layer, and then inside them something happens, some special chemical reaction. These include things like the nucleus and mitochondria and other things, and some of these organelles can reproduce on their own. So here we see a cell just packed with materials and in all sorts of different areas within a cell. And a cell is extremely complex, even though it's really, really small. Okay, so we're going to talk about some cell organelles, not all of them. And here I have a cartoon drawing of a sort of a cell. And these diagrams are meant to show kind of general cells, and they show lots of things. We're going to focus on the plasma membrane, the nucleus, ribosomes, and mitochondria. And I'll mention a couple other things, but that's really about it. You can understand a cell if you understand those few things. So the plasma membrane, it's the outer layer of the cell. It's made up of phospholipids, a bilayer, which means a two molecule thickness, and it forms the outer skin of the cell. But it's much more than just a skin. It has embedded protein, and it's really important to control the transport of materials. And so these transport processes we go over in lab, these are happening at the plasma membrane. But it also contains proteins that are involved in communication, receptors, attachment molecules, enzymes, all sorts of things. And so this forms the skin of the cell, controls what goes in and out in the cell. And affects how the cell interacts with its environment. In addition, in the center of the cell is the nucleus, and this is usually the largest organelle, and it too has a lipid membrane that separates it from the rest of the cell. And this lipid membrane is going to control what goes in and out of the nucleus. And then inside the nucleus, you have a special compartment where the cell houses its genetic material, its DNA. And so there are the DNA and the associated proteins and enzymes that copy and use DNA. And so it's where the cell controls what goes on. It's where new proteins are kind of queued up to be made, and it's active in the reproduction of a cell. The nucleus also contains a special space called the nucleolus, which will have a lot of RNA in it, and it's where ribosomes and RNAs are made. So I've got 2 slides here that are just all text. It's just the stuff I showed you. Here we have the diagram of the nucleus and nucleolus, and then we have some actual pictures. The one on the lower left is a cross-section through the nucleus showing the nucleolus and chromatin, which is the DNA material when it's unwound. And the other one is a freeze fractured on the right, where they break off, and so you can see the inside of the nuclear membrane, and so it shows some of its pores. Okay, so that's just text. I'm going to skip over it. It describes the previous slide, and that just describes the relationship between the nucleolus and the ribosomes. And so here, I'm going to go to the ribosomes. So there's tiny, tiny little dots here shown in the cell, and the ribosomes are about the smallest things we can see with electron microscopes. They're really just very large molecules of ribosomal RNA and protein. And it's actually 2 subunits that come together and are involved in the second part of making proteins. And so here's where proteins are assembled, is on the ribosome. And so it's really crucial because the genetic information that's inside the nucleus, for that to be activated or translated into an actual trait, a protein has to be made. And so this translation occurs right on the ribosome. And so they're abundant. And ribosomes can be free floating around in the fluid inside the cell in the cytoplasm, cytosol, or they could be attached to a membrane where they actually are part of a kind of an assembly line. Okay, and then another really important part of the cell are the mitochondria. And each cell, particularly active cells, have many mitochondria, like muscle cells and brain cells. And these have both outer membranes and inner membranes. The inner membrane is called the cisternae. And this too is where we find lots of ribosomes and lots of proteins in there. And here's where the enzymes occur for us to oxidize food. Mitochondria use oxygen to release the energy from food and store it in ATP. So the more active a cell is, the more ribosomes it has. And ribosomes also contain their own DNA and their own RNA and are making proteins right in the ribosome. Okay, so then, so those are the big organelles. Also, sometimes we're going to talk about the cytoskeleton. This is a network of protein fibers that are too small mostly to be seen with light microscopes, and even the most powerful electron microscopes have trouble with them. And they're involved in movement and structure. And skeleton is kind of misleading because the cytoskeleton can be temporary, it can be permanent, it can change shape. And so it includes several types of proteins, intermediate filaments, microtubules, and microfilaments. And these things can be assembled and disassembled quickly and can change shape. It provides the structure and movement within cells. It's all associated with this cytoskeleton. Okay, can't usually see this in diagrams, but it's there. Okay, another important structure that's we'll talk about less often, but are a network of internal membranes that forms the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus. And the endoplasmic reticulum, this is a kind of an assembly line for the synthesis of proteins or lipids. If it's a protein, it's referred to as a rough endoplasmic reticulum, and then it'll have ribosomes attached to it. If it's for lipid assembly, it will be a smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and you can sometimes have carbohydrates put on there. The endoplasmic reticulum in some cells stores calcium. In other cells, it's connected to something called the Golgi, or near the Golgi apparatus, which packages molecules to be secreted. And so those things might be released after that. Okay, so those are the basic parts of the cell. Most cells will have these things. Remember, cells are the smallest living units of the human body. All of them are surrounded by a phospholipid membrane. All contain organelles that perform specific job, including the nucleus, mitochondria, ribosomes, cytoskeleton, and a phospholipid bilayer. The nucleus is crucial. It stores the genetic information of the cell. It's separated from the rest of the cell. It contains the DNA. Ribosomes are also important. They're made in the nucleus in a part called the nucleolus, and then they're found active in the cytoplasm, and they make proteins. And then mitochondria have membranes, and they contain the enzymes needed to make ATP using oxygen. That's aerobic respiration. Okay, I'll have more on cells in the next program.